What's up, everybody? It's guubums back with another comps video. I know it's been a while, but there's a new patch. This patch was pretty big, so there's definitely a lot to talk about it. There's gonna be a couple new items. I will be referring to them by their new names, but I will explain like some of the components they're built out of, and yeah, hopefully that you guys will understand what I'm talking about. But there was some changes, but for the most part, the comps have stayed the same. So if you guys are seeing a comp that you guys are already familiar with, then obviously you can skip that part of the video. But otherwise, yeah, let's just get into the video. The very first comp I have for you guys is just simple 7 vertical anima. This is a comp that I haven't really recommended since probably like the first patch or two of the set, just because I think the perception on this comp was actually pretty low. Obviously, they did buff it a couple times throughout the set, so maybe the perception was low for a good reason. But a lot of people were playing Marksman Vanguard, which, if you guys are unfamiliar with, is just pretty much a Aphelios Xayah duo carry over this comp, even though structurally speaking, they're actually pretty similar. Just because ultimately you're just going to be playing around Xayah and Leona, except that in this comp, instead of playing around Aphelios, you're generally going to be playing around some sort of AP, Morello, kind of like Shiv or Void Staff now spreader, just because Anima does so much magic damage that eventually these items will find itself onto Aurora, but for the most part, like this is played the same way. You have a little bit less necessity for components such as bow, and pretty much like the difference between this comp and Marksman Vanguard comp really is just the fact that Marksman Vanguard was tied to a Rage Blade. But the reason why this comp is better than the other comp is one, probably that the cap is actually just straight up higher, meaning that like for all intents and purposes it's just a better comp. But also the item flexibility for this comp is actually a lot better, and also the kind of the gold required to hit your board is a lot better. And what I mean by that is like when you're playing for Varks and Vanguard, you're gonna be slamming a lot of Rage Blades, and then if you don't actually hit Aphelios 2, what ends up happening is that like say you have Xayah 2, you're gonna put your items that you built for Aphelios onto Xayah, and because we built those items for Aphelios, they're just not going to be as optimal on your Xayah. So then what ends up happening is that like you're really tied to kind of like hitting an Aphelios 2, assuming you built a Rage Blade. The difference with this comp is that like you can actually kind of put items on a Xayah 1. You do kind of need Leona 2, but ultimately like both comps need Leona 2 anyway, so it's like kind of like a little bit of a moot point. Um, you can kind of get away with a Xayah 1, especially if you're streaking in the mid game. So this comp just ends up having better item flexibility, probably a higher cap, and then also it's just kind of easier to get into because you can play anima from the start of the game. Generally speaking, when you're playing this comp, you want to open anima. Some of the anima augments are pretty good. Support Spire being like the obvious one, but also any trainer golem that gives you an anima crest is going to be really powerful, just because to access the prismatic trace trait for this comp, you actually only need 2 spats. You do kind of have to be level 10, and the reason why I put that in quotation marks is just because oftentimes when you get a spat playing this comp, you're actually going to get it in the form of a target dummy or a golem, either from the portal or an augment. And what that means is that if you get 1 extra spat on top of that, immediately as you go 9, if you hit 1 Aurora, assuming you have all of the other 7 anima units, you'll immediately get that trace trade, and the likelihood that you win the game is extremely high. And the reason why I even bring all this up to begin with, even though it might seem like a niche kind of like aspect of this comp, is just because it's actually just a lot less niche than you think. Sometimes you'll open Wandering Trainer, which is like both gold and prismatic are viable augments. I'd say gold is probably just like a little bit overtuned, so when you're seeing that augment, you should probably be clicking it. When you open that augment, the chance that you get a spat throughout the rest of the game is probably about 50%. I won't really kind of like explain to you guys how I arrived at that number, but you guys just kind of have to trust me. So then the chance that you hit prismatic anima or 10 anima is probably in the realm of like 40%, which obviously means that you win the game immediately, right? Or functionally win the game immediately. And yeah, there's not too much to talk about this comp. I think the only kind of like new thing about this comp is that because Shiv is no longer existing, you have to build Void Staff. I do think for the purposes of this comp, Void Staff is slightly worse than Shiv, just because Shiv can kind of be held on like any random unit, whereas like Void Staff kind of actually ends up onto your main AP carry, in this case mostly Aurora, as you get to late game, but also Seraphine for most of the game, maybe sometimes Yumi, especially if you have AMP in. You should be building the new Striker's Flail. This is just guard breaker of the old patches. It's just really broken, honestly, especially if you have IE, because it's built in a way that you actually want to be stacking crit chance. So like ideally when you're building this augment, you maybe want to go like Last Whisper and IE or something like that. Maybe just like one other damage item or one other crit item. And actually, like, it seems to me that the best build on Xayah right now is probably something in the realm of just IE double flail. So if you manage to get like this many gloves and then you're not using your belts for your Leona, this is a build you can go for. I'd say for the most part, you're not really going to be able to get this build online, bar like Pandora's or anything, but you don't really have to worry about it too much. Just think about Zaya as your standard 380 carry items. You generally want AD items on her, not really Shojin or Rageblade or stuff like that. Those items are acceptable, but ultimately they're just not going to be the best in slot for Zaya. You scale by putting in Aurora on your board at level 8 and 9, and then if you have Aurora on your board, you play Jhin. Otherwise, if you have like a Sejuani 2, it's better to play Sejuani 2. You just itemize Leona with your classic tank items. She does want 1 mana item. I've mentioned this many times in the other videos if I've talked about Leona at all. So Vow, Vow, Warmogs, and even Shroud ends up being her like true biz probably, but ultimately like any tank items will be fine on this, and just make sure you have some sort of Shred somewhere. So if you don't have even Shroud, build Last Whisper, and so forth and so on. Pretty basic stuff, and on to the next one. So this next one is a little bit more complicated just because of all the different ways you can play around what ends up being an Elise core. And what do I mean by an Elise core? So last video that I made talking about comps, I talked about this comp as if it was a reroll comp. And it is a very powerful reroll comp. I think for the most part, the Europeans are playing this as a reroll comp, and I think it ends up capping pretty high. But I think a lot of things are something that a lot of players are kind of like missing out when they're playing this comp is like thinking about it in terms of like just a tempo line. And what do I mean by thinking about it in terms of a tempo line, right? Oftentimes on stage 1, you're going to be dropped in Elise. And the thing is, Elise is such a powerful unit, even in the new patch, that like you can probably streak most of your early game by just playing around Morgana Elise plus any random frontliner. It doesn't really matter, just like any upgraded frontliner will do. I believe the best ones are still going to be bruisers, so if you guys remember my openers video from a couple weeks ago, that hasn't changed. Alistair Mundo or Alistair Gragas plus a Morgana plus an Elise is still the best opener in the game. Nothing's changed there. You can play from a Nitro opener, so say you have like Nidalee 2, Shyvana 1, and an Elise. You can just put Nitro in from the early game, and you can probably even scale towards a T-Hex. But the reason why I talk about all this is just because there's so many ways to play around this core that people kind of get too strung up on this exact 2-2-4 board, which is 2 Syndicate, 2 Vanguard, 2 Bruiser, or sorry, 3 Syndicate, 2 Vanguard, 2 Bruiser, plus 4 Dynamo board, and they end up being like hard pressed to reroll Brahmin Elise, that they forget that this core can actually be played in a variety of different ways. So some of the things that like a lot of players in high-low has been doing is just like playing this around like a 4-4 board, and whether that be 4 Vanguard, 4 Dynamo, 4 Bruiser, 4 Dynamo, or 4 Bastion, 4 Dynamo, all are actually quite viable. And in those cases, I would recommend that you're building towards Misfortune items, just because you're not re-rolling your Elise to a 3-star, just having her as the solo carry for the entire game just ultimately won't get you a top 4 probably. But if you kind of like streak through your early game, or at least like establish a lot of tempo in your early game, and then you scale into an Aurora 2, or like even sometimes an MF 2, and then sometimes an Aurora 2, ultimately you're just gonna be really strong. And then on level 9, like you could always just fit a Zac in. If you're playing the Bruiser or the Vanguard version, in the case of the Bruiser version, like say you're playing Darius, you could actually go ahead and fit 3 Syndicate on 9. I'd say for the most part, it's not going to be that strong, just because like you'd much rather play a strong 5 cost instead. But in the case, let's say you have like a Wandering Trainer that gives you a Syndicate, right? Like you could play these kind of like 4-4 boards while still ultimately having 3 Syndicate in, which will boost the power of your MFs dramatically. And then you just pretty much, in the case that you're playing around these 4-4 boards, you really want to just like itemize your 2-star 4 cost. So if you're playing 4 Bastion, obviously you itemize Sejuani. If you're playing 4 Bruiser, you itemize Cho'Gath. If you're playing 4 Vanguards, then you itemize Leona. I would say, in general, the Bruiser version is the worst of the 3 of the 4-4 versions. I would say probably the Vanguard is the best, but actually the Bastion version is quite powerful, just because your early game is going to be really nice played around Morgan Elise a lot of time, but also because the Exotech that you get from playing Jhin is also reasonable. Ultimately, you probably will just drop Jhin for Aurora anyway, because you can't drop Morgana. The AP just ends up being too valuable through the Dynamo. But if you have a really strong Exotech, say you have Repulsar Lantern, which is probably the best Sejuani frontline Exotech, then maybe you can consider playing the Bastion version. And sometimes, because Braum can get contested by like Twisted Fate players or other players playing the same board, it's actually possible to play for Galio and Elise 3 instead of Braum and Elise 3. Gragas and Elise 3 just doesn't end up doing all this too much, so like don't really think about that too much. But yeah, Galio 3 and Elise 3, it is a possible combination. It's just I want to say all this just to like bring up all the different options you can have while playing around an Elise in the early game. Just because the real kind of like selling point of this comp is the fact that you have an early Elise, right? It's not so much that like this comp caps crazy high or anything like that. But yeah, it's just I want to open up some possibilities to you guys for like how you could play like around this core without kind of like getting lost. I think for the most part, these 4-4 comps, you're not going to be able to win the game, so don't be like too excited about them. It's just it is an option. So if you hit like early misfortune 2, so you're rolling on 7, you hit early misfortune 2, or you're contested, these are the options to kind of get away with getting more placements than you probably otherwise would have, right? The itemization on Elise is pretty simple. It's just blue buff Gunblade +1. The new Void Staff ends up being really strong on her just because it actually gives 35 AP. So if you remember old Shiv, it gives like something in the ballpark of like 15 or 20 AP, which was fine to put on your carry for most of the game, but it was better to put it on a different unit to apply the shred on the enemy team while your carry gets a major third item. Whereas like nowadays, it's actually fine to just put the Void Staff on your main carry, and you'll probably be fine for like I'd say 90% of the game. Maybe in the very late game, you actually move and like go like Death Cap or Giant Slayer or something along those lines. Obviously, it's like completely fine to just put this on Aurora and like shield shred anyway. Always make sure to build your anti-heal and then generic frontline items on any of your tanks. Steadfast happens to be the single best frontline item in the game. Nothing's changed after the patch. It didn't get a nerf, so it's still really, really strong. And yeah, just like your standard, any frontline items just end up working on like all of these. Obviously, depending on the exact unit you end up playing, for your frontline, the BIS like changes maybe slightly, but ultimately like if you're building shred, anti-heal, your release items, and then any real tank items on your tank, you'll be fine. I would recommend against building Sunfire, just like as a rule of thumb for this one, just because most of your damage is AoE, so like Sunfire won't really spread in time. It doesn't really work as like a full tank item, or true tank item is what we kind of call it, just because it just doesn't give enough tank stats. So you want to build true tank items, you want to build a Morello. Elise can hold your Morello for this most of the game, same idea as Void Staff. So yeah, pretty basic stuff. I just wanted to open you guys to more information about these lines, and yeah. Before we get into the next comp, I just like to say, if you guys like the content, please leave a like and subscribe. And if you guys have any feedback, leave it down in the comments below. But yeah, not too much to say. On to the next one. So the next one we have is just Amstrat. I've talked about this comp before. This is actually my personal favorite comp, and there's not too many ways I'd like to talk about playing this comp, just because for the most part, like it's kind of like the same idea always. There's like a little bit of a little nuance where you can go for Yuumi 3 and play it somewhat as a reroll comp, and like some Neferi 3 comps will like allow you to transpose into this comp, but for the most part, like you're really just thinking about going level 8, level 9, and just building these same units and then just capping around Zac and Samira and Garen. So, where's Garen? And Garen. This is your level 9 board, like 99% of games, honestly, if you make it there. And then, for the most part, you're just rolling on 8 for Nico, Annie, Yuumi, and hopefully you can hit someone Samira. I'd say for the most part, when you're playing this comp, you want to be playing it from like a high econ, so whether that be, let's say, like a freestyling 2-1, or like it's a high econ Galaxy, maybe you streak most of your game, and then you can get into this comp either at level 8 or level 9 sometimes. Yeah, you're good to go. So this comp like caps extremely high, because once you get to Samira 2, a lot of Zac blobs and like Garen modding your Annie, Samira, and sometimes even your Yuumi, you're just gonna be really strong, and your Zac as well. You're just gonna be really strong. Standard items, as you guys have seen on any all set, blue buff, Nashor's Shojin is her true bis. It actually doesn't really matter if you have blue buff or Shojin on her. Like I would say you go 1 mana item and then 2 AP items is perfectly fine. I've played this comp multiple times where you just have like blue buff, Archangels, I don't know, JG or Deathcap. So maybe an Ashes is fine as well. Maybe just Shojin is fine. Like it doesn't actually matter. Just make sure you have one major mana item on any, whether that be blue buff or Shojin, doesn't matter. And don't also be afraid to put adaptive on her. So if you have Shojin or blue buff, it's like fine to put adaptive on her. The thing with adaptive that makes it such a powerful item is like you could like if you end up having too many any items, which in some portals or some augments will kind of like enable that. You could just put it on Nico instead, and vice versa, right? Sometimes you have it on Nico, and then like, oh wait, I have too many tank items. How about I just move that to Annie? And adaptive item is just a fantastic item in this comp. So don't be overly greeting your blue buffs and your Shojins just because adaptive helm just ends up probably being better in terms of like a general slam for this comp. Something to note is that like Yuumi 2 is stronger than Annie 1. So okay, sorry, if you have blue buff and no Nashers, blue buff or it's better to put the items on Yuumi than it is on anyone. And the reason for that is like Yuumi just does a lot of damage. So Annie is kind of like a utility bot in a way. It's like you don't actually absolutely have to have any 2 when you play this comp on level 8. It's possible to like go any 1, Yumi 2, Samira 1, and just go 9, and then you just itemize Yumi until you're level 9, and then once you get any 2 on level 9, then you could swap your items with your removers as you see fit. And yeah, more importantly, it's probably better to get like Nico 2, Yumi 2, and Samira 1 on level 8. Obviously, like guaranteeing your Samira on level 8 is not really a realistic plan, so oftentimes when you play this comp, you do want to be playing it on level 9. But sometimes like you'll just have the items for it. You'll have an actual like say an Annie in the mid game, maybe a Yumi 2 in the mid game, something that'll let you like soft skip 8. And what I mean by that is just like you don't really have to roll too much on 8. And even though you're not like streaking the entire game, you can make it to level 9 slowly and then still scale up to your 5 cost to kind of like cap it around your board. Items on Samira are like really basic stuff. I.e. Guardbreaker or Striker's Flail is the new best in slot, but it was pretty much best in slot last patch as well. Last Whisperer is great, but you don't have to build Last Whisperer. You know, AD, GS, you know, Deathblade, GS, even Edge of Night, QSS, all this fun stuff is good on her. Like the items that are like quote unquote bits on Samira are just like pretty obvious. It's your standard crit AD items, but she actually uses all of them. So unlike some champs that kind of like don't really use QSS, but they use IE, don't really use IE, but they use DB, stuff like that. Well, she uses all of them. Just put whatever good items you have left on Samira. Another tip I'd have is like don't play explicitly for Samira items. So in the mid game, like say you built a blue buff, like don't go ahead and just build an IE as well, right? Because like if you don't hit Samira, then the IE is going on your Yumi and your Annie. And if you have IE on your Yumi and your Annie, you're not going to be too happy. Obviously, eventually you will hopefully hit Samira, and then like it'll be really good on her. But yeah, don't be doing that. I think like playing as though you absolutely have to hit Samira on level 8 is just not a strong game plan. So yeah, just looking for that. Pretty standard like fast 8, fast 9 comp. Really strong. Yeah. Next up we have Zeri MF. So this is a comp that was picking up a lot of steam. It's probably towards the end of last patch. It was definitely being played even 2 patches ago, but I think back then, before the buffs was made to MF and even Zeri, I think they both got buffed in 2 patches ago. So it was already picking up steam as like a playable comp because people were definitely struggling to find lines in that patch. And what I mean by that is just like if you build Rageblade, but then there's 2 other people playing Marksman Vanguard, like what can you do? Well, this is one of the comps you can play from a Rageblade opener. And the kind of like nuance to this comp is that like you do really want specific exotech items when you play this comp. The ones you should be looking for are Flux and Pulse. Flux, I believe it's called Flux Capacitor, and Pulse Stabilizer. Yeah, so it doesn't actually matter which of these ones you have on Zeri. They're literally the exact same level of power. The only thing to note is that if you have Pulse Stabilizer, or don't build IE on Zeri ever. But like if you have Pulse Stabilizer on Zeri, then absolutely do not build IE on Zeri is like the only thing I'll add. IE, just put it on Misfortune. It's like totally fine. I have seen some IE Zeri still. I think this is kind of like a relic from an older patch. It's just not good. So don't be doing that. Generally speaking, you just put one of these on Zeri plus a Rageblade plus either a Gunblade or a Giant Slayer or a Deathblade or Hurricane. Doesn't really all that matter, all too much QSS, all that fun stuff. But you want to actually prioritize your MF items. And so like pretty much after your Rageblade, you should be building towards 3 MF items just because Zeri does kind of need Rageblade to function. But your main carry in this comp actually just ends up being Misfortune on level 8. The other kind of like interesting thing about like Exotech kind of like want to talk about with this comp is that like don't play from Cyber Coil. So people think like, okay, your carry item for Exotech comps matter. So in the case of Vex, like you'll see a lot of Hollow Bow, a lot of Hypervangs. I'd say maybe at lower elos you can get away with Cyber Coil, but for the most part, if you really want to like play around the kind of like the cap around this board, you really do want to just be playing it from either Chassis or Lantern plus one of these 2. The order on which 3 or 5 doesn't really matter that much. I think for the most part, if you have Chassis, you do want it on 3, just because in the mid game, if you have like a Mordekaiser, you're like good to go for your mid game. But it doesn't matter all that much, like because the same thing could be said like if you have Jin 2, you definitely want to have one of these 2 items on your Jin 2 for your mid game. So it's a little bit kind of like a moot point. On level 8, you're just playing this exact 8 units. There's not too much of a wriggle room to work with, so I wouldn't think about like kind of like switching out too much stuff. You do kind of need to hit that MF Zeri Sejuani to really get your board online. But if you're fast aiding properly, if you're going to like playing your level 8, playing your econ properly, then it is going to be quite easy to get there. Again, this is like one of your average like Rageblade opener comps, just because like say you have a Kog'Maw too, and you want to build a Rageblade, then you build Rageblade and then you start building MF items. Kog'Maw and Jin are able to hold all of those items right really well. So pretty basic stuff. And then level 9, you just play Aurora. It's your classic, like, play Aurora to cap out comp. It doesn't really matter what items you have on Aurora at that point. Just make sure you have some sort of shred and anti-heal somewhere. So if it ends up happening that you have to put red on Zeri, that's totally fine as your like second, or I guess in this case third item. It's totally fine, and then eventually you can move it to Aurora, and if you can find like a suitable replacement third item for Zeri, that's perfect. Otherwise, yeah, it's just like Morello late game, standard AP items on Aurora to cap out, standard mana tank items on Sejuani are the best, and then like any item on Mordekaiser is fine, like Mordekaiser 2. You have a chassis on him, you should itemize him. If you don't have a chassis on him, you probably don't itemize him too much, but ultimately, because the Exotech tree gives you a lot of items, you're gonna have to like find ways to itemize your units in a way that kind of makes sense, right? So yeah, basic stuff here. Lastly, I have Slayer reroll. The reason, okay, I'm not gonna talk about this comp too much. Like I've literally recommended this comp like 3 or 4 times now. It's really basic, so yeah, you just play for shaco 3 on 3-1 roughly. I'd say as a general guideline for this comp, I'm only recommending it because it really is like a really strong comp, especially at lower levels of play. But I'd say as a general guideline, if you're GM plus, don't play this comp unless you have 4 shakos on 2-1. If you're Master plus, you probably want at least 2 to 3 shakos, and then if you're under Masters, 2 shakos is good enough as long as you have like decent items or like a 2-1 augment that kind of like gets you there. So Not Today, which gives you a free GA or free Edge of Night, very good. Anything that gets you range shako is very good. I will talk about the differences between range and melee shaco again, just in case you guys didn't watch the previous videos. But in the case of range shaco, you just build like, instead of building like Edge of Night and like BT and stuff, you just build like Rage Blade +2. The 2 items can be just like any damage items, so like Giant Slayer ends up being really good. I believe QSS ends up being really good, and the new Hurricane used to be really good. Now they changed that item to Kraken. It's actually unclear how good Kraken is, just because it grants a lot of stacking AD, but then like shaco obviously is a unit that already has a lot of AD from like, it's like 70 from Slayer, yeah, 70 from Slayer, and then also because of his stacking mechanic, he just gets a lot of AD that way. So it's unclear if like Kraken is that good on him, even if you're range shaco. But oftentimes when you're playing range shaco, you actually have to put the item on him, so like you only have room for 2 items. So like the best way to do this is like Rage Blade GS or Rage Blade QSS. Yeah, basic stuff. In the case of range shaco, just don't play Syndicate. Like just play something else instead of that. It doesn't matter. Like you could play like 2 Zeds. 2 Zeds generally caps out with this comp, even if you're playing melee shaco, but you have to go level 9 to do so. So it's a little bit awkward to talk about, but like that is one of the ways you cap out with this board. Zed items include just like, you do want to go full damage Zed. I don't really think building healing on Zed matters all that much. Like Hodge is really nice because it gives him mana, and the reason why mana is good on Zed is just because like he ports really fast, which is really relevant in terms of like he doesn't take too much damage before he starts kind of like hitting your enemy carries. Just put Zed on A3 or A5, either of these 2 hexes, depending on which corner you guys are trying to target, right? Stuff stuff that I have mentioned in the past for sure. So there's not too much to kind of like talk about here. And then yeah, shaco Zed kind of like just dominate the enemy backline a little bit, and you'll probably scam fights that you probably don't deserve to win, honestly. But yeah, I told you guys like how you guys want to get into this comp. So you do want the items in the early game, and you do want a number of copies of shaco that makes sense, that like it makes it so that you're likely to hit shaco 3 on either 3-1 or like at least before 3-5. And even getting stacks on your stage 2 is going to be pretty important. So like if you have 1 shaco, I would never play this comp. It's like totally unviable even at lower ranks. But if you have like 2 shakos, at the very least you have prospects for hitting shaco 2 in stage 2, and then like you can kind of like start stacking that way. And yeah, it's like a pretty strong and basic comp, which is why I felt the need to recommend it once again, because it truly is probably one of the strongest 5 comps of the current patch. And yeah, that's it for the video. That's it for me. If you guys enjoyed the content, as always, just leave a like and subscribe. I already mentioned it before, but yeah, until next time, peace out.